So, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome our next speaker, Daniel, who works with Frank Luntz. And as we mentioned earlier in the program today, back in the first quarter, BMI commissioned a survey of 1,000 parents of K-12 students and to get their opinions on education, the printed book, and a few other things. And we also had Dr. Naomi Barron, who you all have probably heard speak at previous BMI events, write a great white paper on her research and the research that's been done around the printed book in K-12 education. And so we launched all that, and that's been out in the marketplace. And in fact, I just got an email from Dr. Barron yesterday that her research was picked up and published in a whole other scholarly journal, so about our research that Daniel and his team helped do. So what we wanted to do was kind of give you a live, well, we were hoping to be live in front, but you know, as things happen. But Daniel's going to kind of go through the research and what they did with the survey of the parents, and maybe hopefully that helps you all tell a story to your constituents and clients and other people, and we'll go from there. So Daniel, the floor is yours. You're on two giant screens here in Orlando, so have at it.
A little intimidating, but one screen is enough for me, but two big ones will make do. Thank you so much, Matt, for the introduction. And again, my name is Daniel Siegel. I've worked with Dr. Frank Luntz for the past 4 years on messaging projects for clients in politics, in business, in the media, and I would say Dr. Luntz most proudly of within the education space, because that's really an issue that we're extremely passionate about. So when BMI approached us at the beginning of this year, we really jumped on the opportunity to work with you, because especially the challenges that students, teachers, school administrators have faced with online remote learning, we knew the need for physical textbooks was more prescient than ever. So as Matt said, we commissioned a poll of 1,000 parents representing demographics from the Department of Education to really understand what they think about education in this moment, physical books specifically, and more importantly, what we specialize in is the language, the specific words that work, that can really effectively demonstrate why the case for physical books needs to exist. How you communicate with teachers, with parents, with school administrators, really reflecting that voice of the parents, because we think that they are really the most powerful constituency when you're trying to create that change at the school board or the state level. So that was the group that we thought was the most important to raise their voice. So without further ado, let me go ahead and share my screen. I will walk through some of the top line findings, and then I'll pause in between sections to see if folks have any questions. If that's okay, Matt, we can keep going. And then I know we have a limited amount of time, so really want to share with you all the data from our perspective.
Yeah, that's great. If you can go ahead and try to share your screen.
Yeah. Actually, it's telling me that.
Oh, okay, that's what I was afraid of. Just 1 second,
Okay.
and we'll get you. Try it again for me, Daniel.
Perfect. Okay.
Right. Yep, we're seeing it here.
Great. Let me present mode. Okay, so the number one statistic that we want to show you before we get into any of the other language or information is how overwhelming support physical versus online is for schools right now. This figure, 71 to 29%. That is astoundingly high, and these are the kind of facts that we want to arm you with to go to your stakeholders in your local communities to really demonstrate that case for physical textbooks being essential to student learning in the classroom. I mean, really, when it comes down to motivating for school board elections, and I'm sure you can talk about how powerful of an electoral force schools and education were just in the last gubernatorial race in Virginia last week. So it's incumbent on us really to be able to use this attention that parents have. They're really, and we've done a lot of other education pulling in addition to what you see right here on books, but the microscope that schools are today, that the attention parents are due to online learning, getting to really see everything, creates an opportunity for you to really impact and for schools to be a motivating force in these elections that they haven't been in recent history. So we wanted to stick this number in front of you first just to demonstrate how salient it is and how powerful of an opportunity you have to make a difference and have an impact about the outcome of what if school districts are going to use physical learning materials or not. So I'll go on. These are some of our top line findings. We have another slide, but wanted to get you a chance to look at these, starting with the first. As parents used effectively can be powerful spokespeople for your efforts, and it's just arming them with the language that's going to be the most effective. So as we said before, in the previous slide, physical books, the meaningful and measurable impact that they have in the classroom. It's really there. You saw it. It was 71 to 29%. So going off of that basis, in that context, you have an opportunity to really have an impact on your locality. And then specifically, when you get more than that, just aside from the baseline that parents like physical learning materials compared to online, it's that some arguments are going to be more powerful than others. When you talk about comprehension, for example, that's a great argument that is going to have a difference on decision makers and on parents. But for example, when you try to use physical materials as an argument for erasing racial disparity or socioeconomic lines, that doesn't resonate with parents as much. Not to say that that isn't an important argument in your arsenal when you're talking about the benefits of online materials, but talking about quality and comprehension, those are arguments that can be communicated to parents across the board that can really create universal appeal, which is what we're trying to do. We're trying to get every parent from every community to have buy-in for why physical learning materials are essential to the student learning experience. So that's why we have that. Another language finding, the third point on this page, is talking about the pros versus the cons, the benefits of physical books versus the consequences of not having physical books. This may sound very basic and simplified, but in so many studies we've done, when you can talk about the benefits of something versus the consequence of something, it can make a huge swing in what resonates with them. So that's why we think that you need to emphasize that. And again, and I'm sure you all know this, physical materials as a part of online learning, not necessarily to replace it, but if you talk about it as complementary to the student learning experience, then you're going to have to face less opposition. I'll go on to one more slide and then we can pause for a moment. Okay. Again, when you're framing the actual argument around physical learning, you always have to talk about it in terms of the student, not in terms of the book manufacturer. And if any argument that seems like it could be interpreted as, okay, well, this is to protect our business in some way and not enriching the student experience and enhancing their ability to learn effectively in the classroom, then you're not really going to break through to people. They're going to take a very cynical stance. So often and always, when you can reframe it as these are going to benefit students, we're doing this because look at the last year and a half of students having to struggle with learning and their inability to have access to the quality education they deserve. When you can actually always reframe it towards the student, that's going to really magnify the power of your argument. And then going forward also, and I don't mean to contradict myself, but we do want to bring up the challenges that learning during COVID has created, but we want to really frame it towards future learning. How students in the future, given what's occurred now, not to correct the past and the struggles that students have already endured, but to ensure more successful learning in the future for them. That's where the case for physical books come in. So words like learn and understand rather than retain, remember, recall. We'll go into much more detail on this on a later slide, but These are the specific language nuances that we want to raise for you all to take back to your community. And then lastly, distractions. When you're talking about, though, we have recommended that focusing on the positives and the benefits of physical materials are going to vastly outweigh any negative consequences for online. You're going to be raised this question from time to time, and distractions, we've learned, are the most salient argument that can turn people away from online learning and towards physical learning. So those are some of our key findings. We'll go on. Wanted to pause for a second. Does anyone have any questions?
Anybody? So far, so good? All right. I think, Daniel, I think it's great. Thanks for giving us those last two slides just to help with the way to talk about the information that you're about to present on the things, because I do think that's important, that the language we choose.
Yeah, that's exactly. We've learned it with so many different industries and folks, and it can apply perfectly to your objectives in the education space. And also, I know that I think this deck has been circulated, but feel free to take pictures of any of this while you're sitting there in the audience. Sorry I can't join you live in Orlando myself, but please take out your phone, and if anything looks like it'd be helpful to you, feel free to grab a screenshot.
Yeah, and as Daniel mentioned, we do have this on the BMI website now, and there are infographics actually available to some of these key stats and survey responses that you can use. And if anybody sees this presentation or goes to the BMI website and sees the information there, and you want more details or more assets for you to use on your social media or anything like that, please just let me know and I will get them to you, because as Daniel mentioned, and we want to get this out as far and wide as possible. We've sent this via email to the Association of School Boards, the Association of Superintendents. We're trying to get this as widely distributed as possible. So Daniel, thank you. Why don't you go ahead and start with the results slides.
Great. So I won't spend too much time on this next section, but we wanted to just give you a barometer of what parents think when it comes to education and how that really sets up the context for why they are so supportive of physical learning materials as an essential, non-negotiable part of the student learning experience. So even right here, talking about the future, despite the frustrations that people have experienced, they think things are going to get better. And we need to give them a reason to think things are going to get better and link on physical learning materials to why their educational experience for their children are going to be better in the future. So that's some context for you. If you look at America's schools right now, this is a comparison that we think is really illuminating to the parent perspective right now. When you ask them to give a letter grade for America's schools versus their children's schools, everyone is going to be much more critical of the country as a whole than they are going to be of their own schools for their own students, their own children. So you always have to think about, when you're framing the argument, talking about it at a national level versus at their own level. If you talk about it within the context of their own school, people are going to be much more defensive because it's the school that their children go to. When you're talking to parents and administrators and teachers, they know these institutions intimately. But when you can talk about the system as a whole, it's much more distant, much less personal, and people are much more willing to critique and suggest ways to make it better. So that's why we always want to frame it at the national level versus the individual level. This is something else. The biggest issues facing American schools post-COVID. Being prepared for real life, and then look at second, too much focus on computers and online, and not enough focus on reading, writing, and the basics. This, even without getting into the specifics of physical materials, the themes that matter to you rise to the top of what matters to parents right now. So it's just to reiterate why focusing on this issue now, when you're talking to these stakeholders in your local districts, are going to be much more successful at getting through to people than they would be at any other time. So just wanted to reframe that, because look, you have all these different issues about college, about accountability, among morals and values. Two of the top issues, children not being prepared for life, for real life, and then basically the passive-aggressive way to respond to online learning that every student has relied on, or many students have. So I'll continue. And then these are some of the least effective arguments that matter to parents right now when you think about schools moving out of COVID. Okay, I'll continue. And then lastly, in this section, when you're talking about issues as a whole, and these are really issues that you want to ground yourselves in when you're talking about physical materials, it's personal growth and quality. Those are some of the most powerful, and when you can demonstrate that, and actually, when you're talking to people, use these words to raise the need for physical materials, how physical materials contribute to personal growth, they contribute to quality. These are the top attributes that matter to parents right now when it comes to schools, so they should be reflected in terms of what you are highlighting when you're talking about the case for physical books. And look at the bottom. And I just want to point this out just because we thought it was really interesting. Fairness, justice, these are terms that are being really used a lot in the education space right now, and they're important, but when you compare it to things like personal growth and quality, they are not at the top of the parent agenda. So I just want you to keep that in mind for which arguments, which words specifically you should be using to get the widest buy-in from parents when you're talking about physical materials. So I think this takes us to the next section. Were there any questions on any of those last slides?
Anybody? Nope, go right ahead. Keep going, Daniel.
Great. Okay, so we wanted to test in this section an overall reaction to how poignant they think and how effective online textbooks, or no, not online, physical textbooks are to the classroom experience today before we get into the specific language and arguments. I'll walk you through these. So I'll pause right here for a moment because we think this is really important. The impact for physical textbooks versus the impact for online textbooks. We asked them a 5-point scale. What matters more, or which matters in terms of effectiveness, impact, and you see physical textbooks are always registering higher than online. And so, this is not to say, again, like I said in one of my key findings at the beginning, it's not to say that online is not part of the equation. It's part of the equation. It's not the whole enchilada, but it's going to be part of it. So that's why when you can understand that they go together, it's going to create less opposition to what you're trying to achieve. This is another finding that we think is really important to your efforts when you're talking about the format, absorb and master material. Physical online, look at that, 54 to 26%. That's the difference right there, and why we need to keep pressing for physical materials in the classroom compared to them not being there. Not compared to online again, and I'm being redundant now, but how they're part of it, and this demonstrates that very effectively. Here's another argument we tested. When you take it, the same exact question, and we don't give them the option to say neither, physical versus online, just in a vacuum, 69 to 31%. These numbers are off the charts. Really, for us, we're in such a divided country on so many different metrics when it comes to our priorities in the public, and whether you're a D or an R, liberal, conservative, etc., finding consensus this powerful on anything is really notable. And that's why we wanted to raise it with you. This is a number that really transcends political, socioeconomic, racial, spiritual divides in the country. I mean, when you're having 69% of the country that are going to be supporting something, and in this case, it's going to be your cause, physical materials, that is a winning issue. So we want to really drive home that message. Here you go. We talk about, should school districts ensure that there are always printed materials available, classroom learning, even as a complement to digital online. Yes, look at that. I mean, these numbers really, and I said before, 16 to 31 was off the charts, and then we have something that's even more of a consensus among parents here, 88%. And then you see the physical and online. These are parents who, in the previous question, said that they would prefer physical or online when they were forced to choose between the two. So even among parents who say they would favor online, printed materials being a part of the learning experience, the classroom learning, 87% of those parents specifically. So really it is a powerful majority, super majority of parents that want printed materials to be a part of the learning experience for students. And this is important. This isn't that they should just be part of the experience. This is how important they should be to have access to these tools. Again, these numbers are so powerful and really so motivating when you can bring them in front of whatever stakeholders you need to make the case for, or physical materials to be included in the classroom. This demonstrates it. Here's another argument that we wanted to demonstrate. It's, we asked some studies demonstrate that students tend to learn and absorb more when they're reading on paper, but fully online learning is slightly less expensive for the school than maintaining physical books. Which would you support? So you take that cost argument of online versus the comprehension argument for physical learning. And you see that number, 77% of parents want to maintain physical versus abandoning physical. And even among those who favor online at the onset, barely 50% want to abandon physical. That pull towards physical is still there, even among parents who are predispositioned to support online learning and physical learning. So we want to demonstrate all these thematic facts before we get into the language to really demonstrate over and over again, hit you over the head with it metaphorically, that the argument for physical learning is more powerful than ever before. This just demonstrates that once again. And this is echoing the previous slide that we just showed. We just asked it a different way and want you to understand just how powerful the numbers are in favor of your cause. Okay, and then everyone has been engaged in online instead of that, or 3/4 of parents in America. So this is coming out of a worldview and a context where they've all been seeped in the world of online learning at the expense of physical. So you're talking to parents who are authentically engaged in this part of their child's learning, their children's learning. So you're coming at it with a place where they understand the pros and cons of this, but we just need to crystallize it for them in a way that's going to motivate them to act. Because that's really the purpose of this. Not only to inform your stakeholders, but to affect those outcomes and make them become ambassadors on your part, so that it's not just BMI and its partners going to these people, but parents themselves feel this strongly about this. So they're the ones who are in the rooms themselves, making the case to school board, elected officials about to have physical learning materials in addition to online. Here's another argument. Look at this, and this is just communicates what I said earlier. If physical books would make their effort easier or harder, they all say easier. And if you can go to anyone and say 81% of anything believes something, that's going to raise eyebrows and get people's attention. There you go. With screen time for students in school age increasing significantly, particularly with online learning required during COVID, how concerned are you that child is less focused when online than in the classroom? Again, these numbers really can move people because of how broad the consensus is across so many different devices. So the opportunity to present on this really is going to turn heads, we think. We're going to get into specifics now of proof points of online versus physical learning. But before then, any questions about the data that we just showed?
Yeah, 1 second, Daniel. We do have a couple at this point. So just sorry, I have to walk around this room and get the microphone to where it needs to be, which, you know, I'm getting my steps in.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. Just, you know, a comment as well as sort of a question. It's really interesting in this data. When the survey design was done, clearly as sponsored by BMI, there was a hope that, you know, we wanted to see the results that said physical books were important, and there's some art to that, which your company brings in, but the numbers were still staggering. What becomes a challenge for all to the positive, to the fact that physical is important. What also becomes shocking is that our publisher customers, when they go in to see the school boards, the principals, the teachers, and sell their product, they're actively trying to sell the digital. They believe, because if you think about their supply chain, it's cheaper for them to have sell online materials in the long run of their world than the inventories and the management and the cost of physical books. So they're not necessarily on our side here, but it is somewhat incumbent, and I give Matt a lot of credit for helping to get this data out there. And for all of us in this room, I think it's really important that we continue to talk to as many people, whether they're people in our communities or whether they're our customers, and keep pushing the fact that physical is critical.
Yeah, and if I could add one comment to what you just said, I think about, you know, you have a lot of opposition, and it's an uphill battle in some ways that you just described, sir. But just to reiterate that students and parents can be such powerful ambassadors and spokespeople for the case for physical, being able to engage them in these conversations as much as possible versus just the book manufacturers is going to only add to the credibility and believability of your argument.
Yeah, and so just so folks here know, we sent Dr. Barron's white paper and the top 10 list, if you will, the infographic we did of the slides that Daniel's presenting to the, I want to say, 25 largest school districts. We sent it to their school boards as well as the superintendents so that they had it, and then obviously we've sent it out to the associations as well. So Daniel, one more question coming at you.
Right.
I will acknowledge before I raise the question that this may be a bit far afield from what you've covered, but my question for you is how extensible or extendable do you think the research on the value of K-12 textbooks is to the higher education market? Because there, I think, the challenge of replacing physical textbooks with digital is even more significant with programs like inclusive access.
That is a great question, because it makes me wish that we could hold on that as well, so I could have a empirically defined answer for you. But I would have to say, I don't know if I feel comfortable extending this finding to higher ed as well, because really what this is the role of parents and how involved parents are in their education. And we know that parents are still involved in college-age students, but that level of independence is much different. And so what the parents feel is going to be much different. And so since you're talking to an older demographic and parents, the students, whatever, 18 to 24 to 26, postdoc, undergrad, et cetera, versus a parent and the age of a parent demographic, we was like 35, or the most common was like 35 to 50 in that range. So there's a generational gap. So I would be hesitant to extend this finding without doing additional research about if it matters in terms of higher ed priorities as well. But it's a really good question, and it's something that I think is worthy polling as well.
Well, and maybe I now know what a budgeted line item will be next year for research. But anyway, any other questions before we keep it going? All right, go ahead, Daniel.
Great. Maybe bring this back up. Okay. We're we're now going to talk about, we tested a battery of different questions about comparing physical to online over several different attributes when it comes to student learning. We'll walk you through those right now, and then we'll pause again if anyone has any questions. So here you go. Students perform better on exams and tests in schools if they learned primarily, using books, using physical books or online. Physical, 74 to 26. And again, this was the most powerful argument. We tested like half a dozen different arguments, and they descend. So this one had the most support for physical compared to online. So we wanted to put it front and center. When it comes to testing and exams, those are the key themes that we think really validate physical materials compared to online. I'll continue. So this is another metric. Do you think children will be more successful in school if they primarily learn holding a book in their hands? Look at that. That physical sensation of holding a book, 73 to 27%. It really, is something that the physical touch is something that can make a huge difference, and we wanted to validate that in the movie. Having a meaningful, measurable impact on a student's success, physical or online. 72% physical. It's just to reiterate, this is another powerful argument when you're talking about the actual success. So, this is very closely connected to exams and tests, but it's just framed in a different way to give you a different angle and proof point that you can use to your advantage. Methods students are used to stay engaged, focused, and undistracted. They learn primarily using, again, 72 to 28, physical books. Attention and focus in the classroom, it gives the natural advantage to physical books. And we wanted to make it clear to you so you could see this. And this is another great argument that you want to have in your arsenal when you are thinking about the comparison between these two. Here, retaining what they learn in school after they graduate, if they primarily learn physical or online. Retention is another great argument. Okay, I'll continue. And they're only going to go down from here. So as great as these arguments were, some of the other ones that we're going to show tested slightly less in favor of physical books. Preparing students for college and higher education. It's still a powerful number, 69 to 31, but there's a few that are slightly more effective at communicating the need for physical over online. And here's one that we thought was really fascinating. As a parent, would you be more supportive of your local school district using taxpayer dollars to teach this primarily with, and then you have physical versus online. Still a powerful argument, 2 to 1. That's something that is very significant when you talk about tax dollars, but in the grand scheme of things, it registers lower in terms of the importance in some of the arguments that we just explored. And then it goes down from here. Completing homework accurately and on time, 66 to 34. Again, it's still 2/3. So overall, these arguments by themselves are really effective and are going to work when you're presenting to school board officials, school administrators, etc. But there are some that just work better than the others. The process to internalize and truly understand what they learn in school. Here's the comprehension argument. So at the top of your list, you have test taking and exams and how physical can support that. And then lower, yet still powerful, you have the bang for your buck with tax dollars. You have homework, you have comprehension. And here's one that we thought was really interesting. and it actually will lead into the language findings that we explore next. It's which method teachers do a better job helping. So it's asking it from the teacher perspective rather than from the student. And physical still beats online, but you can see it's almost 10 points less in favor of physical than some of the other arguments that we just explored. So it goes down from here when we're framing it from the teacher perspective. So always, this is just a chance to reiterate how coming from the student perspective is going to be much more powerful in communicating the benefits of physical books than online. And again, we really tested it across a lot of different comparisons. This one, most notably, a lot different than the other ones. Students be more equipped to tell the difference between real and fake news and to think critically and accurately about subjects affecting society that they primarily learned using. Again, physical is still, beating online pretty handily, but it's a lot less convincing than the arguments that we just showed. And then you see we continue to go down in salience for physical materials, with students being more likely to develop team building and collaboration skills that they're primarily learned using physical. You'll never see online beat physical. And that's something that's notable. Outright, physical will always take precedence over all these metrics, but the intensity for physical changes across this. And that's where we think the finding is. It's really one of the least effective. And here, the last one in the set, and then we'll pause again. What would have a greater impact on breaking down the racial, socioeconomic, and community divides among students? The schools primarily decided to use. So if you're talking to a school board official who this is really one of their top priorities, creating equity in education, physical books are not going to be, this is not going to be an effective argument for that frame. And so we really wanted to just test it among so many different measures across the hard science, I guess you could say, with testing, homework comprehension, and then something a little more wide-ranging and thematic like social justice here, and how effective physical learning materials are for that case. And they're not as effective. Okay, now we're going to get to the language. I wanted to stop again. Any reaction, any feedback?
I think we're good, Daniel. We got about 5 minutes.
Okay.
So yeah, if you want to go ahead and hit that next section.
Let me make sure we can walk through all the language here with the time that we have. Students to learn versus teachers to teach. Again, this just reiterates the point that I made earlier, framing it around students versus teachers. If you have to compare, or at least lead with students before you talk about teachers, because they're the audience that really is a higher priority for them. And we asked it just a slightly different way. The last time was the priority that matters, and then this time we asked it within the context of textbooks and learning materials. Still, the way students learn, the way teachers teach. Students over teachers. All the respect in the world to any teachers or former teachers in the room with us today, but when you're making the argument for physical materials, the students coming front and center is going to add much more credibility and ultimately to a more effective argument that's going to lead to the change that you want. Learning new information versus retaining past. And I know on a slide before, we talked about how physical books were effective for retaining information. But when you compare these two, and this is the language you want here, new information versus retaining past, they focus on the new. So that's what you're going to want to focus on. It's about gaining new information, not just remembering things that they've already learned before, to put it in a very simplistic way. Specific information, a lot about a few targeted topics versus a little about a broad range of topics. We wanted to really be granular here about how you're talking about materials. Are you talking about just a few, or are you talking about many? And although it's not as overwhelming as some of the other findings that we've shown you thus far, it still is important to note this language finding that talking about a few targeted topics, it's a greater priority. This is a great question that we're really excited to share with you. Should the type of textbooks and materials students use in schools put them in the best position to, this is a quintessential language finding. Look at understand and learn and how much better they do than all the other language findings. And they're really about the present and the future versus you see at the bottom, remember, retain, recall. And that's why we put that in our finding earlier. When you can frame physical textbook learning through the prism of these verbs, it's going to make your argument much more effective. If a school district decides to abandon physical textbooks, what outcome would it concern you the most? We don't want to focus on the negative too much because we think the positives of physical books are much stronger, but you want to also know the most effective arguments when you have to invoke them in your communications. Distracting. More distractions and less learning are the most compelling consequences of no physical textbooks. And you have it right here. It's like no argument even comes close. Quality of teaching, student grades will suffer, student inequality will decrease. It's about distractions. Pretty straightforward. And we wanted to test some longer arguments, paragraph form that you can use for your communications versus just the proof points and the topics. So this argument that did the best by far when it comes to learning, what happens in the classroom is essential. That word essential is really powerful. When students have printed materials in front of them, they focus, and that's good for both teachers and students. Again, actually in real time, if I rewrote this, I would say for students and teachers. But students reading from a computer quickly and easily becoming distracted. We need students concentrating on the task at hand. Those are the things when you put it in a long form that really can make a difference. And then here are the least effective arguments. They're not persuaded as much by arguments that talk about the societal divide and some of the social justice related spaces. They just are not, they do not link that with physical learning. So you're at your own risk if you try to use it as a focal point of your argument for physical materials, erasing economic, racial, societal divides. It's an important argument, but in the context of physical learning, things like quality and preparing for real life and test taking are going to be much more salient among your audiences than the ones listed here. Why do we need a more personalized education system that is tailored to each student? At the end here, we really wanted to explore some other topic areas that we think would be helpful to your efforts, more broadly speaking. So when you're talking about a personalized education here, this argument of every child is unique. Or when it comes to education, one size doesn't fit all. These are arguments that really are effective among students in each year. 32 to 16%. And that's it. Again, it was let me get back to this. 1,000-person sample. We wanted to really explore this issue in depth from all angles, from the top level attributes down to the specific language recommendations that are going to most help your efforts. So that's it. And on behalf of Dr. Luntz, who I'm sure wishes he could be here himself, was really grateful for the opportunity to present on this important information to you all.
Awesome. Thank you, Daniel. So I got a couple hands raised here, and then we'll wrap it up.
Great.
Great presentation. Thanks very much. Really interesting stuff. I just was curious, did you see any real delineation from the areas that you polled? For in other words, did rural schools or maybe inner city schools that may have less access to online skew higher to physical books versus maybe kids that go to a prep school that have better setup for online learning because computers and whatever?
I think that it is a great question because it's something that, you know, might sound like there would be an advantage for online for those urban schools that utilize tech more, but we didn't include any of those breaks because it was across the board. For parents, the prescience of physical materials compared to online, it didn't matter if you were DRNR, it didn't matter if you were rural or urban. This was something that was so overwhelming that it didn't even break another way. So that's why I wouldn't even bother with those breaks, but duly noted.
Anybody else? Well, Daniel, appreciate you taking the time, and hopefully we do something like this again. You can join us in person, but we appreciate you being here virtually and answering those questions, and hopefully our audience enjoyed that information. I will, we'll get the presentation. I mean, these slides are already on the BMI website, but we'll get them to you in a easy to digest link, as well as the slides from the other presentations from this morning. But with that being said, Daniel, thank you so much. Appreciate you being here.